She once believed that marriage meant safety, warmth, and companionship, yet life had something much different waiting for her in the shadows that gathered silently around her days and nights. Her name was Alina, and she entered her marriage with dreams as wide as the sky, filled with colors of hope and trust and beauty that she imagined would remain forever. Yet slowly those colors began to fade as reality wrapped itself around her like iron chains, unseen but painfully heavy. The first few weeks were peaceful, or at least quiet, and she tried to convince herself that quiet meant happiness, even though a strange fear settled in her chest every time her husband raised his voice or stared at her with cold, unblinking eyes that seemed to judge her very existence. As months passed, the quiet grew darker until the darkness became unbearable. Days turned into nights, and nights turned into long, torturous hours where she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning what she had done wrong and why her life was drifting into a storm she never saw coming. Her husband began to insult her, at first only with words sharp enough to slice through her confidence and slowly destroy the fragile dreams she carried within her heart. Each insult took away a piece of her, until she barely recognized the young, hopeful woman she once had been. Soon, the insults grew into threats, and the threats grew into violence. Physical, emotional, and psychological violence that left her trembling in the bathroom, trying to silence her sobs so the walls would not hear her pain. She learned to hide her bruises beneath clothing and makeup. She learned to walk slowly so that her ribs would not ache. She learned to lower her gaze so she would not provoke another wave of rage from the man who once promised to love and protect her. Her family lived far away and believed she was happy because she lied to them again and again, pretending everything was fine. She could not bear the shame or the fear of being blamed or judged, so she stayed silent, burying her truth deep inside where nobody could find it. Isolation became her closest companion. She had no friends, no support, no voice, and no strength to fight. She moved through life like a shadow, barely existing, barely breathing, clinging to the idea that maybe one day things would change. But they never changed. Violence only escalates, and soon she reached a point where she could no longer deny that she was in danger. Not just harm, but real danger, where her life could be taken from her in a moment of uncontrolled rage or hatred. One night, her husband grabbed her by the arm and threw her against the wall, screaming until his voice cracked with fury. Her head hit the surface so hard that stars burst behind her eyes, and the world spun as she fell to the ground, shaking with fear. She lay there, helpless, numb, and frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to think. She watched him leave the room, slamming the door behind him, and for the first time, she understood that silence and obedience would not save her life. When the house finally went quiet, she crawled to the mirror and looked at her reflection, bruised, swollen, and distorted. She stared for a long moment and whispered to herself, asking why she was still here, and if this was truly the life she was meant to live. She began to understand that she had lost herself somewhere along the way. She had lost her laughter, her voice, her dignity, her safety, and her dreams. And the realization pierced her deeper than any physical pain. Days after that incident, she moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding conflict, avoiding eye contact, doing everything she could to prevent another attack. Yet the fear remained constant, pressing against her chest until breathing became a struggle. She started to think about leaving, but leaving was not easy. Leaving required courage, resources, and support, and she had none. But still, the thought lingered in her mind, glowing faintly, like a small candle in total darkness. She imagined what freedom might feel like, waking up without fear, walking without trembling, speaking without permission, laughing without guilt. And that imagination became her secret escape when reality became too heavy to bear. But imagining was not enough. She needed to act, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that staying would eventually kill her, either slowly through emotional destruction or suddenly through violent rage. Night after night, she planned quietly inside her head, building a fragile map of escape, even though she had no idea where she would go, how she would survive, or who would help her. She told herself that anything was better than dying in that house. Her husband continued to rage and threaten her, and every time she flinched and shrank away, he felt stronger and she felt smaller, until she could barely feel her existence at all. She had become invisible, not only to him, but also to herself. One late evening, she found a small, old phone hidden in a drawer, left unused for years. She charged it secretly during the night when he was asleep and searched for helplines, shelters, and services for women facing abuse. Her hands shook as she read stories of other women who escaped violence and became survivors. She read about shelters that offered beds, food, and legal assistance. She read about counselors who listened without judgment and lawyers who defended women in court. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she was not alone in this world, that other women had survived the same nightmare, and that survival was possible even for someone as broken as she believed herself to be. She saved numbers on the phone, memorizing them in case she needed to destroy evidence quickly. She hid the phone under the mattress, and every day she reminded herself that she had a way out now, even if she was not ready to take it yet. Weeks passed, and the violence grew worse, until one night she decided she would leave, even if she had nowhere to go. She would leave because staying meant death, and leaving meant hope, however small, however uncertain. This moment was the beginning of her transformation, even though she didn't know it yet. Even though she still felt terrified and powerless, something inside her was shifting, a silent, resistant strength rising from the ashes of everything she had lost. The night she decided to leave was quiet in the kind of way that makes every sound louder, every heartbeat stronger, every breath heavier. And she lay on her mattress, staring into the darkness, feeling the weight of fear pressing against her chest, yet also feeling a small flicker of courage begin to glow somewhere deep inside her soul. Her husband had fallen asleep after another evening of shouting and threats, and she listened to his breathing from across the room, waiting. Waiting for the moment when she knew he would not wake easily because the slightest sound could trigger his anger and ruin her only chance. When she finally stood from the bed, her legs trembled under her weight as if they were learning to walk for the first time. She moved slowly through the room, picking up her small bag and slipping her old phone inside, along with the few bills she managed to hide from grocery money and a small picture of her younger self, because she needed a reminder that she once existed without fear. She opened the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding like a drum in her ears. She walked step by step until she reached the front door, praying silently that no floorboard would creak, no key would jingle, no sign would betray her escape. She felt sweat on her forehead and neck, but she did not stop. She could not stop, because stopping meant dying inside that house. When she finally stepped outside, she felt the cool night air hit her skin, and for the first time in years, she did not feel suffocated by walls. She closed the door gently and walked down the street with quiet determination, her arms shaking, her throat tight, her stomach churning from fear, yet every step taking her farther from the cage she had lived in. Her destination was not clear. She only had the number of a shelter written in her mind and the hope that someone would answer, someone would believe her, someone would help her survive and heal. She reached a small corner of the road near a streetlight and turned on the old phone, dialing the number with trembling fingers as tears rolled down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of freedom mixed with terror. A woman answered with a calm, steady voice that instantly made Alina feel seen. She explained her situation in broken, nervous words, struggling to hold back sobs and hyperventilation, yet the woman listened with patience and understanding and asked her where she was. The shelters sent a volunteer in a small car to pick her up, and when the headlights approached, Alina felt her knees weaken because she realized she was no longer alone in her struggle. When she entered the car, she expected questions or disbelief, but instead she received a blanket, a bottle of water, and a soft voice telling her she was safe now, even if it did not feel like it yet. The ride was short, but every minute felt like a lifetime because she stared out the window trying to absorb the fact that she had truly left that house, that she had truly chosen her life over her silence. They arrived at the shelter, a modest building with warm lights and a locked gate, and when she walked through the entrance, she was greeted by two women who looked at her with empathy rather than judgment. That simple look broke something inside her, and she began to cry uncontrollably because she finally felt allowed to feel something other than fear. They gave her a small room with clean sheets and a bathroom, and they told her she could rest as long as she needed and that she would not be forced to make decisions before she was ready. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the white wall while her hands shook and her body trembled from the release of years of held tension and pain. For the first time in many months, she slept without flinching at footsteps, without bracing for shouting, without praying for dawn to come quickly. And when she woke the next morning, she felt confused by the silence because she had become so used to chaos that peace felt unnatural and terrifying in its own way. She was led to a small common area where women of different ages sat drinking tea and talking softly. Some had children clinging to their sides, others sat alone, staring at the ground as if trying to process their new reality. The counselor introduced herself and asked Alina if she wanted to talk, and Alina nodded, even though she was not sure she could speak without shaking. The counselor listened to her story without interrupting, without doubting, without blaming, and that simple act of listening made Alina feel seen for the first time in years. The counselor explained the stages of trauma, the cycle of abuse, the warning signs, the patterns. And slowly, Alina realized that none of it had been her fault, that domestic violence never begins as obvious violence, but as manipulation, control, isolation, and psychological harm that grows over time until the victim forgets who they are. The shelter provided her meals, toiletries, clean clothes, and therapy sessions. They explained her legal options, such as restraining orders, divorce proceedings, and documentation of injuries. They taught her about financial assistance, temporary housing, job training, and community resources. She learned that her situation was not rare, that thousands of women walked this path each year, and that survival required support, not shame. In the second week, she joined a support group session where other survivors shared their experiences. And for the first time, Alina heard voices that echoed her own fears and her own pain. One woman spoke about escaping with her children, another spoke about hiding money for months before she could flee, and another believed she deserved the abuse until therapy taught her otherwise. Each story was different, yet connected by the same thread of trauma and courage, and Alina listened with tears in her eyes, feeling both heartbreak and strength growing inside her. She finally shared her story, her voice trembling at first, then flowing like a river that had been blocked for too long, and the women nodded, embraced her, and told her she was brave. Therapy became a crucial part of her healing journey. She learned about trauma responses like hypervigilance, dissociation, self-blame, anxiety, and depression. She learned breathing exercises, grounding techniques, and journaling practices that helped her manage panic and flashbacks. She learned that healing was not linear, that some days she would feel strong and other days she would break down, and both were normal. She also faced the legal system when a shelter advocate accompanied her to file a report and document injuries. She felt terrified of retaliation, but the advocate explained the safety measures and restraining orders that could protect her. She realized she did not have to fight alone. Weeks turned into months, and slowly she began to rebuild pieces of herself. She started taking classes in counseling and social services because she felt a deep need to help women like her. She volunteered at the shelter, sorting supplies, talking to new arrivals, and offering quiet support because she understood their silence, their trembling, their exhaustion. Every day she grew a little stronger, a little louder, a little more alive. She laughed again, but not the forced laughter she used at home, rather a real laugh that came from a place untouched by violence. She looked in the mirror and slowly recognized the woman staring back, not the broken, frightened shadow, but someone who survived, someone who endured, someone who fought for her life. One afternoon, she stood outside the shelter, feeling the sun warm her face, and she realized she was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live again, and this realization became the foundation of a future she never imagined she could build. Alina began the next stage of her journey with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew healing was not just about escaping violence, but also about reclaiming herself, piece by piece, and that required time, patience, and courage. She had survived the storm, and now she needed to learn how to live in the world beyond it. At the shelter, she enrolled in educational programs that helped survivors build new skills, including writing, communication, counseling, and trauma awareness. And she found herself fascinated by the psychology behind abuse, how abusers manipulate, isolate, and condition their victims, and how victims internalize blame, shame, and silence until they forget their worth entirely. Learning these truths hurt, but it also set her free, because knowledge dismantled the lies she had carried for years. She realized she was not weak, she was not guilty, she was not the problem. She had simply been trapped in a cycle that many others had endured and survived, and this understanding made her feel less alone and less broken. Her therapy sessions continued weekly, and she learned how trauma rewires the brain, making survivors hyper-alert, anxious, sleepless, and fearful, even in safe environments. She practiced breathing exercises that slowed her racing heart, grounding exercises that kept her from dissociating, and affirmations that helped rebuild her internal voice. Her therapist encouraged her to journal daily without worrying about structure or grammar, just letting her thoughts spill freely onto paper. At first, the pages were filled with fear, confusion, and sadness, but slowly they transformed into strength, clarity, and purpose. Because the more she wrote, the more she understood herself, and the more she understood herself, the less power her past had over her. Outside the therapy room, she experienced victories that seemed small to others, but enormous to her. She walked alone to the store for the first time in years without glancing over her shoulder every second. She sat in a cafe, surrounded by strangers without feeling suffocated. She answered questions in group discussions without trembling. These simple moments showed her that healing was possible and that progress was real. Shelter life was not always easy. Some mornings she woke from nightmares, soaked in sweat and shaking. Some days she could not eat because her stomach twisted in knots. Some nights she lay awake replaying memories she wished she could erase. But every time she broke down, she found herself surrounded by women who understood, who offered hugs and tea and silence without judgment. And this sisterhood kept her going. As part of her long-term recovery, the shelter helped her apply for temporary housing, and within a few months, she moved into a small apartment with a single bed, a tiny kitchen, and a small table by the window. It was not luxurious, but it was hers, and when she entered that space for the first time, she burst into tears because she had never lived anywhere she felt safe before. She decorated the apartment with soft blankets, warm lights, and small plants she watered each morning. She cooked for herself, she read books, she listened to music without fear of being yelled at for the volume or the genre, and she slept peacefully, knowing no one would scream or break things or drag her across the floor. She was alone, but she was free. Finding employment was the next challenge. Her resume showed gaps due to years lost in abuse, and she feared employers would judge her or reject her. But her caseworker helped her build a new resume, highlighting her volunteer experience at the shelter and her growing training in counseling and social support services. And eventually, she secured a part-time position at a community AIDS center. Working there changed her life because she was surrounded by people who dedicated their time to helping others, and she learned how to assist clients, find resources, navigate systems, and feel seen and heard. Every success story strengthened her belief that helping others was not just a job for her, but a mission born from lived experience. She continued volunteering at the shelter on weekends, sitting with women who had just arrived, trembling and terrified, just like she once had been. She would offer them tea, blankets, and most importantly, reassurance. She would tell them that escaping was not weakness, but strength, that healing was not impossible, but slow, and that their lives had value, even if someone once convinced them otherwise. Each woman she met reflected a different version of herself. Some had children, some had no documents, some had been married for decades, some were scarcely adults, yet the pain in their eyes was always familiar. And when she listened to their stories, she felt her heart ache, but also burn with resolve, because she wanted to be the voice she never had the day she escaped. Months rolled into a year, and by then, Alina was living independently, working, studying, and growing. She completed certification courses in trauma-informed care, crisis counseling, and survivor advocacy, and as she learned more, she became confident enough to speak publicly about her experiences. Her first speaking event was at a local community center, and as she stood behind the podium with dozens of eyes watching, she felt her throat close and her hands shake because she had never spoken to her trauma to such a large audience. She took a deep breath, grounding herself the way her therapist taught her by feeling the weight of her feet against the floor and the cool air against her skin. When she began speaking, her voice was soft and shaky, but as she continued, her words grew steadier and louder. She told her story not as a victim, but as a survivor who escaped, who healed, who rebuilt, and who refused to remain silent. She talked about warning signs, cycles of abuse, the impact of trauma, and the importance of support systems. The audience listened in silence, and when she finished, they stood and clapped. Some came up to hug her, some wiped tears from their eyes, and others whispered, "Thank you," because her story had touched them deeply and given them courage. After that event, she was invited to schools, conferences, and workshops where she educated others about domestic violence prevention, trauma survivors' rights, and empowerment. She never glamorized suffering, nor exaggerated details. She spoke truthfully, honestly, and fiercely, because she wanted the world to understand that abuse was not just bruises and broken bones, but psychological cages that crushed identities and silenced voices. She also became involved in policy advocacy, joining local organizations that work to strengthen laws, protect survivors, expand shelter funding, and improve legal processes for restraining orders and custody cases. She attended meetings with lawmakers, presented survivor perspectives, and fought for change with passion and dignity. Some days were overwhelming, especially when stories triggered flashbacks or memories resurfaced unexpectedly. And during those moments, she leaned on her therapist, her support group, and her journal, because healing was not finished, it was ongoing, and she accepted that she didn't need to be perfect to be strong. 2 years after leaving her marriage, Alina stood in front of her apartment window watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and violet, and she realized something profound. She realized that she no longer hated her past. She no longer wished to erase her experiences. She simply wished to use them to build a better future, not only for herself, but for others. She understood that suffering had shaped her, but did not define her, that survival had tested her, but did not limit her, and that advocacy was not just her profession, but her purpose. She was not the broken girl who escaped in the night anymore. She was a woman who had rebuilt her voice, her strength, her faith, and her life. Alina entered the next phase of her life with clearer purpose and stronger resolve than ever before. She had rebuilt her foundation piece by piece, and now she was ready to expand her voice beyond shelters and community events. She knew that domestic violence was not just a personal issue, it was a social crisis rooted in silence, stigma, and lack of awareness. So she committed herself to breaking that silence wherever she could. She began by joining a national organization focused on survivor advocacy and education. They welcomed her not as a charity case, but as a professional with first-hand expertise. Her lived experience became her credential, and her empathy became her tool. She attended training sessions, conferences, and networking workshops to deepen her knowledge of law, psychology, crisis intervention, and policy work, and every new skill she learned helped her guide others more effectively. Her days often felt long and heavy because advocacy work required listening to painful stories, supporting survivors through legal challenges, and confronting systems that failed to protect victims. But Alina found meaning in this difficulty. She believed that emotional labor was a necessary part of healing the world, and she had already survived worse storms than any workplace could bring her. In addition to her organizational work, she continued public speaking. Invitations increased as news of her courage spread. She spoke at universities, high schools, police training seminars, hospitals, and community centers. Her goal was not just to share her trauma, but to change minds and hearts. She explained how abusers manipulate victims, how victims often stay due to fear, financial dependence, shame, or threats, and how society frequently judges victims instead of supporting them. These truths opened eyes and shifted attitudes, one audience at a time. She also contributed to research studies by sharing survivor insights on trauma responses, legal barriers, and recovery resources. Researchers valued her honesty because statistics alone could not capture the emotional complexity of abuse. Her perspective helped shape educational material that future professionals would use to better support survivors. Outside of work, she continued to build her personal life. She formed friendships with women from support groups, counselors, advocates, and fellow survivors. These relationships were built on trust, mutual respect, and shared understanding. They celebrated birthdays together, visited cafes, watched movies, and uplifted each other during difficult moments. And this community became a source of joy that Alina once believed she would never experience again. She also adopted a small rescue cat she named Hope because the cat had been abandoned and terrified, much like Alina once was. They healed together, and the cat curled beside her each night, offering silent comfort that eased her lingering fears during thunderstorms or sudden loud noises. Despite all her progress, Alina still faced difficult days. Trauma does not disappear simply because survival turns into strength. Sometimes she woke from nightmares drenched in sweat, hearing echoes of shouting that were not real. Sometimes certain scents or voices triggered flashbacks that sent her heart racing and her breathing uneven. During these moments, she did not judge herself. She used grounding techniques, therapy sessions, and calming routines to regain stability. She understood that healing was not the absence of pain, but the ability to move through pain without losing oneself. Her journey took a major turn when she was invited to speak at an international conference on gender-based violence. This was the largest audience she had ever faced, and the event included researchers, leaders, lawmakers, counselors, and activists from around the world. Preparing for the conference demanded weeks of reflection and writing. She wanted her speech to carry not only her story, but the stories of countless survivors who had never been given a microphone or a platform. She wanted to be their voice when the world had chosen to ignore them. On the day of the conference, she walked onto the stage wearing a simple outfit and carrying no prepared script because she wanted her words to flow directly from memory and emotion. When she began speaking, her voice filled the auditorium with calm force. She shared the silent horror of psychological abuse, the invisible wounds of emotional manipulation, the life-threatening nature of control and isolation, and the profound strength required to escape and rebuild a life. She told the audience that survivors are not weak for staying and not foolish for loving. They are human beings trapped in cycles designed to break them. She demanded stronger legal protections, more shelters, more counseling resources, and better education systems that teach young people about healthy relationships, consent, respect, and empathy. Her message resonated deeply. The audience listened without moving, and when she finished, they rose to their feet in sustained applause. After the conference, journalists, activists, and government officials approached her to discuss collaboration opportunities and interviews. She agreed to many of them because she recognized the power of media in changing public attitudes. Soon, she appeared on radio programs, talk shows, podcasts, and online webinars, telling her story and sharing educational insights, always with grace, truth, and unwavering clarity. She did not sensationalize her trauma. She used it to educate and empower. Then, she joined a coalition that advocated for legislative reforms. They pushed for faster restraining order processing, emergency shelter expansion, survivor privacy protection, and mandatory trauma-informed training for police, judges, and social workers. Through meetings with lawmakers, Alina became the survivor voice at tables where decisions were being made. She told them that policies could either save lives or destroy them, depending on how they were written and enforced. Her words left an impact, and several proposals gained real traction in government spaces. She also worked with local police departments, helping them develop trauma-informed protocols for domestic violence calls. She explained that survivors often appear calm, conflicted, or detached due to trauma rather than lying or exaggerating, and that immediate disbelief from officers could put victims in greater danger. Her training sessions improved officer empathy, accuracy, and intervention outcomes, and she witnessed these changes firsthand when survivors reported better treatment and safer rescues. Meanwhile, she launched workshops for community members, teaching them how to recognize warning signs, how to help friends experiencing abuse, and how to speak to survivors without judgment or pressure. She reminded them that asking, "Why did you stay?" is harmful and ignorant. The better question is, "How can I support you now?" Because survivors need compassion, not interrogation. Her online presence grew as well. She developed educational content on social media using simple language and survivor-friendly tone. She shared resources, hotline numbers, safety planning tips, and inspirational messages. Many survivors messaged her privately, saying that her posts gave them strength to escape their abusers, or to seek therapy, or to simply believe that they were not alone. Alina responded to as many messages as she could, always reminding them that they deserved safety, love, and dignity. Through all of this, she continued her formal education, eventually earning credentials in social work, counseling, and trauma studies. She never imagined she would return to school, yet learning became part of her empowerment. Each class expanded her ability to help others more skillfully and ethically, and her professors admired her for bringing lived experience into academic spaces. 3 years after leaving her marriage, Alina stood on a stage at a large women empowerment summit, looking out at hundreds of faces filled with admiration and anticipation. She spoke about transformation, resilience, and advocacy. But this time, her tone carried something new: joy. She talked about how surviving was only the beginning, how healing was a long road, but a possible road, and how advocating was a way of turning pain into purpose. She could see softness and pride in the eyes of the young girls in the crowd, who saw in her a model of courage and dignity. After her speech, she walked outside into the evening air, feeling the breeze against her skin. And she thought about the night she escaped with only a bag, a phone, and trembling legs. Back then, she was running from hell. Now, she was walking towards a future she created with her own hands. And that contrast filled her eyes with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. She returned home to her small apartment, greeted Hope, the cat, who curled around her legs, and she sat near the window with a notebook, reflecting on how far she had come. She wrote that surviving was the hardest thing she ever did, but speaking out was the bravest, because when she spoke, she gave others permission to speak. When she healed, she showed others healing was real. When she fought, she opened doors for others to walk through. And this realization marked a turning point in her identity. She was no longer just a survivor. She was now a builder of safe spaces, a changer of laws, a speaker of truths, and a protector of others. And with this identity fully formed, Alina stepped into the final stage of her journey with purpose and intention. She was no longer moving for survival alone. She was moving to change the world because she understood deeply that her story was not just for her. It belonged to every woman who had suffered in silence, every survivor who had been blamed instead of believed, every voice that had been crushed under fear and control. She wanted to create real change that would outlive her and reach people she would never meet in person. Her first step toward this legacy was founding her own nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence and educating communities on prevention, healing, and advocacy. She named it the Rising Voices Project because she believed that when survivors spoke their truth, their voices became powerful enough to lift others from darkness into possibility. Starting a nonprofit required endless hours of paperwork, strategy meetings, funding applications, and coordination with experts. But Alina was not alone. She had a network of counselors, lawyers, social workers, volunteers, and survivors who believed in her mission and wanted to stand beside her. They rented a small office space with bright windows and welcoming furniture, and they filled it with brochures, legal resource guides, emergency contact lists, and soft blankets because they knew that survivors needed both practical help and emotional warmth. Soon, the Rising Voices Project launched its first 3 programs. The first program was crisis support, which connected survivors with shelter referrals, legal advocates, counseling services, and safety planning. The second program was community education, which provided workshops for schools, workplaces, hospitals, and law enforcement. The third program was survivor leadership, which trained survivors to become peer mentors, advocates, and public speakers. These programs grew rapidly because the demand was immense. Survivors reached out through email, phone calls, and social media, seeking help, guidance, and hope. Some were planning escapes, some needed housing, some needed therapy. Some needed someone to tell them that what they experienced was real and wrong and not their fault. Alina hired staff who reflected the diversity of survivors, including immigrants, refugees, LGBTQ individuals, disabled individuals, and women from rural and urban communities. She believed that no single voice could represent all survivors, so she created space for many. She encouraged her staff to practice trauma-informed care, which meant listening without judgment, validating feelings, offering choices, and respecting autonomy. She reminded everyone that healing belongs to the survivor, not to the helper. Her work gained national attention, and she was soon invited to participate in legislative hearings where she gave testimony on the impact of domestic violence and the gaps in support systems. She sat before lawmakers and explained how abusers often used financial control, isolation, immigration status, and children as tools of power. She explained how survivors needed fast shelter intake, safe housing, affordable therapy, and legal protection. She emphasized that delayed action cost lives. Her testimony influenced several reforms, including emergency relocation funds, expanded shelter capacity, and mandatory trauma-informed training for family court judges, because too many survivors lost custody battles simply for trying to escape their abusers, and Alina refused to let those injustices go unchallenged. She also partnered with healthcare systems to train nurses and doctors on how to identify signs of abuse during routine visits, because many survivors show visible injuries or psychological symptoms long before they disclose the truth. The trainings improved survivor safety, reporting systems took shape, and survivors who once left clinics unseen and unheard now left with resources, safety plans, and referrals. Despite her growing influence, Alina continued to work closely with individual survivors because she never wanted to become distant from the people she served. She met with women in cafes, shelters, hospitals, and school parking lots, listening to their stories and helping them create safety plans. She sat with them during court hearings, she connected them to trauma therapists, she arranged safe transportation for escapes. She spent nights awake answering hotline calls because for her, this was not a job, it was a responsibility born from lived experience. One evening, a young woman named Sophia contacted the organization, terrified that her husband would find her. She had 2 small children and no money. Alina drove with a volunteer to pick her up and bring her to a safe house. During the car ride, Sophia kept apologizing for being a burden, and Alina gently told her, "You are not a burden. You are a human being who deserves safety." That simple sentence broke through the guilt and shame that abuse had carved into Sophia, and she began to cry quietly as her children slept in the back seat. Moments like that reminded Alina why she continued this work, even when it exhausted her. Because every survivor she helped was a reminder that escape and healing were possible, and that no one deserved to suffer alone. As years passed, the Rising Voices project expanded to multiple locations and formed partnerships with schools, universities, media outlets, religious institutions, and corporate workplaces. Each partnership widened the reach of survivor support and prevention education. Soon, they developed online courses, mobile safety apps, multilingual resources, and youth education programs that taught teenagers about healthy relationships, boundaries, consent, conflict resolution, and empathy, because change needed to start early before harm took root. Alina also wrote a book that combined her personal story with educational insight and survivor guidance. It became a bestseller, not because of sensational details, but because of its honesty, clarity, and compassion. Survivors read it in shelters, counselors used it in therapy sessions, teachers assigned it in university courses, and family members used it to understand loved ones in pain. With the success of her book, Alina traveled across countries, speaking on international stages. She visited refugee camps where women faced gender-based violence during displacement. She visited rural villages where abuse was hidden behind tradition and shame. She visited cities where survivors struggled with legal systems that ignored their pleas. She listened with humility, because even as an advocate, she knew she still had much to learn about the global dimensions of violence and resistance. During one conference in another country, she listened to a survivor who had escaped forced marriage and honor violence. Her courage moved Alina to tears after the session, bonding through shared understanding without needing to explain their pasts, their pain, or their triumphs. Alina realized that sisterhood between survivors transcended borders, languages, and cultures, and that advocacy was a global movement, not just a national one. Despite her public success, Alina remained grounded in her private life. She maintained her therapy sessions, she spent weekends gardening or reading novels, she visited the ocean whenever possible because the sound of waves soothed the parts of her soul that still carried scars of fear. She cooked for friends, she took vacations with her support group, she practiced gratitude meditation and rest. She had learned to love herself not through perfection, but through acceptance. She no longer hated the girl who stayed for so long. She understood why she stayed, and she forgave her for it. She no longer defined herself by the violence she endured, but by the strength she cultivated. She no longer hid her scars. She honored them as proof that she survived. On the 10th anniversary of her escape, the Rising Voices Project held an enormous celebration, attended by survivors, advocates, lawmakers, teachers, doctors, social workers, and community members. There was music, poetry, storytelling, and recognition awards for those who had made significant impact. Alina stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, each representing a different chapter of her journey. She spoke about the night she left her home with nothing but courage and a small bag. She spoke about the shelter that saved her, the therapists who guided her, the friends who loved her, the survivors who inspired her, and the communities that supported her. She reminded everyone that change was possible because they were living proof. Then she invited Sophia and her children onto the stage. Sophia now worked as a counselor for the organization, and her children thrived in school. They hugged Alina in front of the audience, and the room filled with tears and applause. Alina finished her speech by saying that being a survivor was not an identity of shame, but a badge of resilience. That advocacy was not about speaking for others, but about opening space so that others could speak for themselves. And that healing was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. When the event ended and the crowd dispersed, Alina stood alone on the balcony overlooking the city lights, feeling the night breeze against her skin. She closed her eyes and remembered the girl she once was, afraid, silent, and trapped. Then she opened her eyes and smiled softly, because she knew that girl had not been weak. She had been fighting for her life in the only way she could, and she had won. With that realization, Alina accepted that her journey had come full circle. She had survived, she had healed, she had built, she had taught, she had changed, she had loved, and she had helped others rise. And now